So good afternoon. My name is Mike Niehaus. I'm here this afternoon to talk about customizing Windows 10. It's kind of a good place to start off at least talking about the options that we have for deploying Windows 10, and then we'll dive in specifically on the kind of the traditional image-based deployment. We're trying to encourage as many customers as possible to go the in-place upgrade route as a mechanism both to get from Windows 7 and Windows 8.1 as well as to stay current on Windows 10, to be able to easily go from whatever you're running today to Windows 10 using a process that pretty much does everything for you. With in-place upgrade, it automatically preserves apps and data and settings and just migrates everything forward to the new OS. That's great for existing devices. It's great for staying current with Windows 10. It's not so great for new devices. So at the very least, you probably need to look at options for doing new devices. Now, we would typically talk about doing provisioning for that as a mechanism to avoid imaging altogether. Let's take the device that's shipped from the manufacturer and transform it into something that can be used productively. And we've made a lot of progress to enable that, but there are still shortcomings with that. So in a lot of cases, organizations still look at traditional deployment using an image-based approach, using MDT, using Config Manager, bare metal deployment, or something like that, to take new PCs and re-image them. You can still also use an image-based deployment to go from Windows 7, Windows 8.1 to Windows 10. That makes sense if you're going to be making any other large-scale changes to the configuration of the OS, like upgrading every application, changing from x86 to x64, moving from BIOS to UEFI. There are plenty of scenarios where you really need to do a traditional deployment because you're going to deploy a new image to the device and wipe out whatever was there before. So when you can, in-place upgrade. When you can't, traditional deployment is still around. So let's then talk about traditional deployment. In order to do this, you need a newer ADK. We would recommend that you use the ADK for Windows 10 1607, primarily because it addresses a variety of issues that have come up with the previous ones. If you want to, you can use the ADK for 1511 as well. That will work fine to deploy Windows 10 1511 and Windows 10 1607. Be aware though that the ADK for Windows 10 1511 doesn't get along very well with Config Manager. There is a hot fix that you need to manually apply to your Windows PE boot images to make that work. 1607 fixes that, so it's best to move to Config Manager, to a Config Manager version that supports the ADK 1607, which would be the 1606 release, and it takes care of all those issues. MDT, the current version of that is MDT 2013 Update 2. There is a new update due probably within the next couple of weeks. Just depends on when the team gets around to pushing all the buttons to release it. It's pretty much ready to go, but it's just a collection of additional bug fixes. So it'll be a new release. It won't be MDT 2013 Update 3. It won't be MDT 2016. It'll just be MDT. Version numbers are old-fashioned, so let's drop the version numbers and consider that kind of a continually updated release as we determine that we need to fix anything, which typically is just going to be to add support for new operating system capabilities or releases that come out. So you will see that coming. We'll use MDT 2013 Update 2 here just because the fixes that we're talking about don't have any major impact on any of the scenarios that we're talking about. So we will publish a list of all the fixes that we've made just so that you're well aware of that, but for the most part, they're fairly minor. In the case of WSUS, you really want to be running WSUS 4.0 or higher to support Windows 10 because that's the only version that supports feature updates. You can do patching with the monthly updates using WSUS 3.0 on Windows Server 2008 and 2008 R2. But once you get to Windows 10, you want to do more than just patch it. You want to be able to use the feature updates to go from, say, 1511 to 1607, and you can only do that if you're using a WSUS version that supports that. That would be WSUS 4.0 with a hotfix applied, or if you're running Windows Server 2016, the built-in WSUS on Server 2016, which would be considered WSUS 5.0, fully supports that as well. There was an issue with WSUS 3.0 that I suspect none of you were actually aware of that we fixed. The WSUS 3.0 product, if you want to think of it as a product, wasn't originally part of Windows Server 2008 and 2008 R2. It was an out-of-band release. It shipped as a separate component that you needed to download and install. So it had a different support lifecycle than the OS that it was running on. The OS would go through 2020. The WSUS support lifecycle only went through July of 2017. That was coming up pretty quickly, and we could still see that there were millions of WSUS servers out there running on WSUS 3.0 on Server 2008 R2. So we've extended the support for WSUS 3.0 through January of 2020, corresponding with the operating system that it's running on. That said, you still do want to move forward to Windows Server 2012 or higher with WSUS 4.0 or higher to support feature update deployments. In the case of Config Manager has basically an N-1 support policy for Windows 10 feature updates. So each time you come out with a new Windows 10 feature update, it'll be supported by the Config Manager current branch that comes out at around the same time as that feature update, plus the one previous. So with Windows 10 1607, Config Manager 1606 is recommended because it adds support for the new OS features, but 1602 will work fine to deploy and manage Windows 10 1607. When we come out with the next one next year, exactly when that's going to be, we haven't disclosed yet, but whatever the current Config Manager is at that time and the N-1 version at that point will be what's supported. So you do need to keep up with Config Manager and their current branch releases. They expect to come out with those about every 4 months. So the timing won't necessarily be exactly in line with the Windows 10 updates when they come out, but as long as you're within the last 2, you should be in good shape. To support Windows 10, we updated the key management service running on Windows Server 2008 R2, 2012, 2012 R2. We updated that again recently to support Windows 10 Enterprise LTSB 2016. If you aren't running LTSB 2016 and you've already deployed the hotfix to add support for Windows 10 that came out last year, you don't have to do anything. The new hotfix is to support 2 things, Windows Server 2016 and LTSB 2016. Those require new MAC keys and a new KMS hotfix and a new KMS key that goes along with that. So if you're planning to deploy any of those, you need to apply the new hotfixes to enable that support. Notice that there is no hotfix, though, for Windows Server 2008 R2. Windows Server 2008 R2 is in extended support, so we're only doing security fixes for that release. So if you're using that for your KMS servers today and you want to support Windows Server 2016 or LTSB 2016, you need to upgrade your KMS servers to at least Windows Server 2012. When we look at imaging for Windows 10, there are a variety of recommendations. First one is try to build in an environment that's not connected to the internet, because there are things that happen in the background on Windows 10 that can interfere with the image creation process, like the Windows Store kicking in and starting to download app updates while you're building your image. So if you can do that, great. That avoids all of those issues and it makes the process very repeatable. If you can't do that, or if that's not convenient, or if you're actually leveraging the internet to do patching from Windows Update directly, it can still be done. You just need to watch out, especially if there's any long periods of time where the machine is able to wake up and perform those type of background maintenance tasks that would make changes to the system. To try to simplify the process of patching a machine, we do periodically refresh the media. We'll probably do that at least once for each Windows 10 release. So we released Windows 10 1607 back in beginning of August. probably early next year, we'll refresh it again after we've declared that Windows 10 1607 release as a CBB release, ready for broad deployment. So at that point, we would have new media available for convenience. You could download that, drop it into MDT, and deploy with that. The advantage of doing that is it has the latest cumulative update pre-injected into it. But that's really the only advantage. It's not going to be any different otherwise than the original Windows 10 1607 media. It's not a new build number, it's not a new release, it's just take the old bits, mount it, inject the latest cumulative update, commit the changes, create an ISO out of it, and put it on the Volume License Service Center for you to download. So if you wanted to do the same thing, you can do that yourself. You can take the install.wim, mount it, inject an update into it, and then deploy with that modified WIM. If you look at what MDT does behind the scenes, that's something that it can do on the fly. So if you wanted to, you could download the latest cumulative update for Windows 10, put it into your deployment share, and MDT would automatically inject it into the OS as part of the installation process. So that's an easy way of doing it, but if you look at the size of those updates, it is going to add several minutes to the deployment time to download that and inject it into the OS. There have been some issues with Windows Update in the 1607 release of Windows 10, so you'll probably want to do that with Windows 10 if you are doing any type of patching during your build process. So if you have specified in MDT that you want to talk to a WSUS server as part of your image creation, there are bugs in the Windows Update service that have been fixed in the cumulative updates, but those bugs cause the Windows Update agent to crash when it's talking to WSUS. Well, that then causes your task sequence to hang because the Windows Update agent that we're trying to script in the MDT scripts isn't able to ever complete. It just sits there waiting for updates to download, and they never download because the agent had crashed. So you do want to grab at least the current cumulative update, inject it into your deployment share, and then do your deployments based on that, because that applies the fixes to get around those issues. We see a lot of customers that try to do too much in their images. We really want to encourage customers to minimize the customizations that are made. So don't get too carried away with this. You don't want to tweak every little setting, every possible configuration in the OS. You just want to do the absolute minimum to support your environment. Now we'll look at some of the typical customizations that we're talking about, but really beyond that, it should be what do I need to do to save time and really to potentially make the operating system configured so that, well, maybe it doesn't generate as many support calls. Like if you're used to today opening up a PDF file, and that PDF file should launch Acrobat Reader instead of Microsoft Edge, okay, maybe you want to customize the application mapping so that you can control that. But you don't want to be digging into File Explorer registry settings. You don't want to build default user profiles if you can avoid it. Copy profile overall is still kind of an evil thing, but still a lot of people use that and tweak lots of things. We want to try to get away from that and stick with a more generic operating system. You can put new apps into an image. Obviously, saving time is one of the key things, so building an image to deliver new applications out to PCs is a good thing to do. It's fairly typical to put Office and other productivity applications into the image to save time. You do need to think consciously about what your browser strategy is, since we now have 2 browsers included in the OS. We think that it works really well to use Edge for modern sites and then configure enterprise mode so that IE is used for backwards compatibility. With Windows 10 15.11, we had policies in place that would automatically redirect you from Edge to IE whenever it was necessary based on your enterprise mode site list. In 1607, we added a new parameter to IE to direct you back. So you can set it up so that if a person goes into Edge and types in a URL that requires IE, okay, it launches IE. Now they would have a tendency to type in a URL in IE and continue browsing in IE and never switch back to Edge. So now if they went and typed in bing.com into IE would look at that and say, that site's not on the compatibility list, let's move that back over to Edge. So it would launch a new tab in Edge to load that particular web page. So that's the recommended strategy. If you're using any other browsers, then you have a little bit of extra work to do because you would have to make that other browser the default. We'll talk about how you would do that later on, but basically you just need to change the file associations to say my default browser is going to handle these instead. If you've built recovery images in the past so that you could basically do a bare metal recovery from an image that was stored on the hard drive, you can't do that anymore with Windows 10 because it doesn't support recovery images anymore. It actually will reconstruct the operating system using the WinSXS folder, which contains all the OS components. So anytime you do a reset my PC, it's going to rebuild the OS from those files. So don't worry about creating recovery images anymore. You may want to look at the provisioning package support that's been built to do that, but just keep in mind that that's basically it's kind of an OEM focused scenario. An OEM can install a generic Windows 10 installation. They can layer the applications that they want on top of it, and then they can run the USMT scan state utility to say create an apps and driver provisioning package. So you can run scan state with a couple of new command line parameters and it will spit out a provisioning package as the result, which is the full delta between the original Windows 10 operating system and everything that they layered on top of that. They can then take that provisioning package, put it on the machine, which can be a several gigabyte file, and then anytime the PC is reset, it rebuilds the OS from WinSXS, but then it can reapply that provisioning package to give you all the OEM stuff back. So you could do a similar thing yourself. You just need to keep in mind that those provisioning packages are very hardware specific. So you would need a different one for each model of machines that you're supporting since they contain drivers and hardware specific applications. Universal Windows apps are another key thing to understand. First, you need to be aware of the differences between these and other types of applications. First, the installation of Universal Windows apps are per user. So every user has their own installs. You don't have to have admin rights to install an application. So anyone can install apps. We do have a process called provisioning. That provisioning process allows you to stage a machine on stage an application on the machine so that it automatically installs for each user the next time they log in. So that's the process that you would use with imaging. You would provision a new app into the image and then it would install automatically for each user that logs onto the machine. We see a lot of people trying to create images that don't understand this, that think that they can just log on as the local administrator account, uninstall the apps, and then sysprep and capture, which doesn't work at all because the apps are still provisioned in the image. After you sysprep, after you deploy the image, log back in again, all of those provisioned apps reinstall for each user on the machine. So in order to remove apps, you have to deprovision them. In order to add apps that will show up for every user, you have to provision new ones. So it's worth understanding the process for how to do that so that you can customize the images. We also see a lot of people who want to update the inbox apps so that when the user first logs on, it doesn't, in the background a few hours later, start downloading the latest application versions. It's possible to do. You can go to the Windows Store for Business, find the installation files for all the inbox applications, provision new versions into the OS, and then sysprep and capture. But they're updated so frequently that they're going to be out of date within a week, so probably it's not worth going through the hassle of doing that. Now you can add your own applications. If you've got developers building Universal Windows apps, you can take the installation files that are output from Visual Studio and provision those applications into your image as well. So they would hand over the necessary AppX files as well as the certificates that were used to sign those, and then you can deploy those as part of the image. We've had a lot of discussions around sysprep as well. When we released operating systems every 3 to 5 years, it was pretty easy to say, you just need to rebuild a new image. You can't take your old image, upgrade it to the new OS, and then sysprep and capture. But now that we're coming out with more frequent Windows 10 updates, we have the less sophisticated customers out there that say, no, I can't possibly rebuild an image. Well, if you're using MDT, rebuilding an image is dropping in the new install.wim, telling your task sequence to use that one instead, and then running the task sequence and having it spit out a new custom image. So that's pretty easy to do. That's what we would recommend doing. But there are some customers out there that just can't quite handle that process. So we did add support now for sysprepping an upgraded OS. So you could take a Windows 10, 15, 11 image, upgrade it to Windows 10, 1607 via WSUS, Config Manager, or whatever, sysprep it, capture that as a new WIM, and then deploy it. It would work fine. I wouldn't say that that's a great idea, but if you're trying to be lazy, you can go through those steps and do that. So let's talk about then just the kind of the starting point. What we want to start with is MDT. Obviously, I'm going to talk about MDT because I wrote most of it, but we're going to use that to create our images. So I have a machine with MDT installed and a deployment share already created where I've imported the operating system for Windows 10 Enterprise 1607. That's the one that we want to work on here. Oops, yeah, it's always good to switch. So I've got my deployment share, Windows 10 1607 x64 imported into it, build 14.393 unpatched, so everything's good to go there. We would start off by creating a new task sequence, which would be what we would customize. Just call that one demo. Standard template, choose the OS, and take all the defaults for everything else where possible. So that becomes the starting point. Then we can take that particular task sequence and start customizing it to add in the things that we want to change. So then the first thing would be, well, what do we want to change? Usually number one is let's get rid of some of those apps because we don't like the inbox applications included in Windows 10. So to help with that, I published a blog that gives a sample PowerShell script for doing that. That script is designed pretty much to just enumerate all the applications that are included in the Windows 10 image and remove them all by default. If you don't do anything else, it removes them all. That's not recommended. You want to then tweak the script so that it only removes a subset of those because there are some that are actually useful. You might not agree, but I personally like having a calculator app at least installed in the operating system, so you probably don't want to remove them all. So let's look at that, what you would need to do for that. Obviously, you would start off with the script. So I've got a blog post that points to the script. Actually, this is the second one. The original script is on this blog. That is just a PowerShell script called removeapps.ps1. This walks you through the steps of setting it up in the task sequence, and there's a link there where you can download it. So I've already done that on my server. I've downloaded the file. So let me switch over to a client machine, which I've conveniently stopped in the middle of the task sequence. That's not what I wanted to do. So when you deploy an operating system using MDT doing a bare metal deployment, if you hit the F8 key, it'll open a command prompt. And with that command prompt open, it won't reboot. It'll wait for that command prompt to go away. So I selected a task sequence to deploy Windows 10. I got it all the way to the point where it's ready to reboot into Windows 10 and then stopped it, because I can do fun stuff here. I can start tweaking the operating system. A convenient thing to do here, since I've got the operating system on the D drive, ready to boot up as soon as I exit out of here, I can do things like remove apps. So here, the applications are part of the original install.wim that's been staged to the drive. I want to remove them offline just to make sure that they don't get updated by any background tasks once we get into the new OS, and it saves time overall, because if I remove them offline, we don't have to wait for them to install per user when the administrator user signs in. So if I map a drive back to my server where I placed that script, I can just go into PowerShell and run the script. So remember, I said by default it removes all the applications, and of course it says execution policy needs to be enabled. Then I can run the script. And that'll take a little while, because it's actually going through and removing all the inbox applications, but at the same time, it's keeping a list. And it's going to take that list and write it into an XML file. So as soon as this is done, we'll be able to take that XML file and copy it into our deployment share, because the script knows to look for that XML file, and if it finds it, it processes what's in that instead. So initially, we get the full list of applications, and they're all removed, but we can then edit that file to shorten the list. While we're waiting for that, I don't remember how long that one takes. Let's switch back over to the server, and I can show you what the end result looks like. Always helps if I'm in the VM. So if we look at deployment share folder, sure, give me admin rights to it. In the scripts folder, I have the remove apps PowerShell script, which is kind of a sizable script, but most of the logic that's in there is just to make it generic enough to remove the apps that you've selected. The real logic is this one command. If you are running offline in Windows PE, you want to do remove AppX provision package, pointing it to the operating system that you're wanting to remove. If you're running this online, you just specify that for the currently running OS, I want to remove the package with this name. So that's the main logic. All the rest of this is just logging and figuring out what applications to remove. It figures that out by looking at the XML file. This XML file I've shortened from what was generated by the script execution to just remove a few applications. IE is not going to cooperate, probably because it doesn't have read access to that particular file. So let's do it this way. In fact, you can see it right there on the screen. RemoveApps.xml has a list of 6 applications in it that it will try to remove. 3D Builder, Bing Weather, Solitaire Collection, the Xbox application, and Zune Music and Zune Video. So those 6 apps will be removed the next time this script runs. If we go back to the client machine, hopefully it's finished by now. Okay, it has finished. If we look on the X drive in the Windows temp folder, It writes the log file there as well, but the XML file has the full list of applications that we could remove. So all I really did was selected the ones that I didn't want, like Solitaire, Xbox, and Zoom Music and Video. Save that file, copy removeapps.xml to my deployment share. Into the scripts folder, and the removeapps.ps1 file is there as well. So if I were to reboot this PC to continue the deployment, all of the apps have been removed. Well, actually, we can go ahead and do that while we're thinking about it, and we'll see what the end result of that actually ends up being to show what kind of the next challenge is. So that's how you would do it manually. Now the step would be, let's put that into a task sequence. So if we go back to our server, we can find the MDT task sequence that we created before and find an appropriate place to stick that. Really, any place after in the post-install phase is okay. I typically put it after Windows RE and before the next phase has been set. So we can add a step in to run a command line, and then because you really don't want to see me type these command lines, we can run the script to run removeapps.ps1. Now remember before, I had to enable the script to run, so I needed to set the execution policy. The easiest way of doing that in Windows PE is to just poke in the registry entry, so it's useful to have a couple of additional steps here. So we'll do a run command line step, one of which sets the execution policy to unrestricted. And the other enables the execution of scripts. So we can put those into the task sequence. And apply those changes. So we've got one to set the execution policy, one to enable scripts, and then finally to actually run the removeapps.ps1 script, which will then know to open up the XML file and process only the applications that we told it to remove. So that would be the first step in the task sequence. We can get rid of those apps. The next step then would be, well, what if I want to add new ones? So if we push the right button, we can add applications pretty much in the same way. The easiest way is, well, if your developers are creating them, they're going to give you everything you need. If you want to do this using publicly available applications, that's where the Windows Store for Business comes in. So using the Windows Store for Business, we can sign in, find the applications that we want, download all the installation files for them, and then add them to MDT, which will then provision them onto the machine. So if we look at Windows Store for Business, we can see what that process would look like. So let me open up a browser here and go to Microsoft.com business-store. And then sign in with the Azure Active Directory account that has access to all of this. So my admin account and password. Then lets me search for apps that are available in the store. Any of those that are available with offline licenses I can acquire and add to my application inventory. So I've already got some apps in my inventory, which right now include online licensed apps, which can only be installed using an Azure Active Directory account, and offline licensed apps, which can actually be provisioned into an image. In this case, I could filter just to show only the offline apps because those are the only ones that MDT can really deal with. The online apps have to be installed as the real user. MDT doesn't run as a real user, it only runs as the local administrator. So offline is the only thing that works. But if we select one of those, like Delve, we can see the details for that application, which includes some metadata that we could download, which includes bitmaps and descriptions and that kind of thing. But then we can also get the application files. So if we want the x64 application files, we can get the AppX or AppX bundle, which is the main app file. So we can download that, do a save as, and let me create a folder here. Just call it demo. And I'll put the AppX bundle into that folder. But I'm not done yet. Then I need a license file. So I can say I want an unencoded license, which is an XML file. I want to generate that, which then downloads it. And I want to save that into the same folder. And we're still not done because there are also some required frameworks. So we have to download each one of those, both for x86 and x64 if there were any. So we had to download that and put it in a folder structure so that MDT understands what's where. So I had to create a dependencies folder. And then in that dependencies folder, create an x86, and then save the file in there. And repeat that process for each of the dependencies. So for this one, download, save as, in the same folder. Same thing for the third one, save as, into the same folder. So we end up with this folder structure where we've got the main AppX and the license file, the dependencies folder, and then x86 and x64 folders underneath that. That then can be added into MDT as a new application. So we can go in and say we want to create a new app with source files. Let's just call this one Ignite NZ. The application name doesn't matter, we'll just call it app. For the source folder, I can browse to that folder that I just created. Which is here. And then I need to specify a command line, which is probably the worst part of this process, because in order to specify the command line, I need the name of the AppX file, which is not something that you can possibly memorize and type in yourself. So this is the AppX bundle. We want to select that entire name, copy it, paste it in as the command line for this application, and it gets added as an application for MDT. So MDT then recognizes that, oh, this is an AppX bundle. I will take a look at that folder structure and turn that into a very long DISM command line that specifies to install the AppX with this license, with all of these dependencies, and to provision that into the operating system. So we can then add that into our task sequence to install that application automatically. So that would be the next step there. We could go into our demo task sequence and put this in the right place. Now the easiest time to provision an application is once we're in the new operating system, because that's when MDT installs applications. If we wanted to do it in Windows PE, it would be a little bit more work. But then we just need to specify that we want to install an application, and we can select the app that we just created, which is this one. Okay, so then when we deploy that task sequence, that application would be provisioned, and then it would install automatically for each user on the machine. Which leads us to the next step, customizing the start menu. This is actually a required step as soon as you remove any of the inbox apps that were pinned to the start menu. It's probably a required step all the time because as we'll look at the PC that I was building on before, but it has some placeholder icons on it for apps that get automatically installed as soon as the machine is able to access the internet. If you don't want Flipboard and Twitter and Candy Crush and other things like that showing up on the start screen, there's a policy where you can configure that to turn it off, but it still leaves those empty placeholder tiles on the start menu. So we want to get rid of those, and we want to build our own custom layout that has a more reasonable configuration. The easiest way of doing that is by just setting up a Windows 10 machine and manually configuring the start menu and then exporting that. So first let's go over to that PC and see if it was done yet. So this was the PC that I had paused in the middle of the process. We let it continue on. If we look at the start menu now on this particular screen, this is what we see because we've removed applications, and all of those down arrow apps, those are the placeholders that will eventually be replaced with real applications pulled from the Windows Store. Things like Twitter and Candy Crush and that kind of stuff. So we want to configure the start menu to be a little bit more reasonable than that. Let me switch over to a different VM. This one should work. We'll do that manually, where we basically just go in and arrange it the way we want. So we'll unpin all of these as quickly as I possibly can. Maybe we don't want the store, we don't want Skype, maybe we don't want photos, don't want inbox mail, don't want calendar. So it's really just a question of configuring this exactly the way we want it, and then capturing that as a new layout. Fortunately, we only need to do this once. We don't need to do this during the task sequence because once we've exported the layout, we can apply it during the task sequence so that it's then used as part of the image that we're building. So having Edge is okay. We should probably make it a little bit more friendly. Maybe we'll add a calculator or something to that just to give us a second tile. Put that into the group, and we'll say, okay, that's our preferred layout. Maybe we can even rename it. Let's just call it good stuff. So at that point, we just need to run PowerShell, and we can do export, start, layout, and specify where to put it. We're eventually going to want the file to be called layoutmodification.xml, so I'll go ahead and name it that now. But if we look at that file, it just has the XML representation of what we want to be on the start screen. So Edge and Calculator are the two items that are there. So we can copy that file to the server. And we could then use it from there. So that's all we really needed from that machine. We kind of used it as a donor for the start menu layout. But before we actually make use of that, there's one other thing that we want to take a look at because it actually uses the same file. So we go through the steps of manually configuring the layout, we export them, and I never pushed the right button. We can then add that to the task sequence or manually import it into the default user profile, which is then used for the new logons. But the next piece then that we want to look at is the taskbar, which is something that we added in Windows 10 1607. We have the ability to pre-configure the taskbar with whatever icons we want in it. It uses the same layout modification.xml, so we just paste in the additional content that we want into that file, and it applies not only a default start menu layout, but it also configures the taskbar with whatever icons that we want. So if we look at my server again, actually first let's look at the instructions on TechNet. It walks you through a few examples which talk about how to do the simple configuration. Basically, you create the XML by hand. There's no way to export a start menu layout, but you can then specify additional stuff that you want to add. Or maybe you just want to replace the complete layout. So you've got the flexibility to say, yeah, I just want to append some things to the default layout, or I want to replace the entire start layout with the taskbar configuration with the configuration that I put in. You can go even farther and make it specific to country and region. So there's a lot of flexibility in the capabilities that you have with the taskbar. So what I have on the server is that layout modification.xml file. And if we look at that one, I've already dropped it into my deployment chair scripts folder, because this would be too tedious to type. Let's open that up in Notepad, and we can see the layout that we were looking at before. So those were the two icons that we wanted to pin. Actually, I did Cortana the last time I did this. I did Calculator this time, but you get the idea. And then I had to paste in the example from the TechNet documentation and then tweak it for the applications that I actually want to pin. So in this case, I'm saying that I want to completely replace the taskbar layout. So I put that into the XML. And then I specify the two icons that I want to pin. So I want to pin Edge, and I want to pin File Explorer, which in effect causes the others to be removed. Well, what's the other app that's pinned by default? The Windows Store. So as a result of doing this, the Windows Store disappears from the taskbar. But if you wanted to set a different default browser, you have other things that you would want to do. We'll talk about those later, but then you could also pin that into the taskbar as well. So once we've got that XML file, the documented steps will say to copy that into the new image using the PowerShell commandlet called import start layout. The challenge with import start layout is it's a little finicky to run it in Windows PE, and I want to automate this as part of a task sequence. So instead of doing that, I can just add a step to copy it into the right place, which is really all that commandlet does. So we'll add another step here to run a command line. And again, you don't want to see me type this command line, so we'll copy and paste. Where we're just going to X-copy that into the OS disk, which usually ends up being D when we're building an image, but MDT sets a variable to point to that. So we can say OS disk users default app data local Microsoft Windows shell. That's where the file needs to go. So we can add a step in to put that file into that location, and then when the OS is deployed, it will pick up that default layout. So I did a deployment of that earlier just to show what that looks like. Let me switch to a different snapshot. So we can see the end result. where I had just, using that same paused task sequence, I manually copied the file into that location just so that I could see that it worked, and then I let the task sequence continue so that I could then check out the start menu and the taskbar layout without having to do a full deployment. Having to run these task sequences over and over again gets to be a little tedious. So we have the task sequence completed. I intervened in it and did the manual configuration, so we can see the taskbar or the start menu layout here, and we can see the taskbar configuration, which, as soon as we dismiss this one, just has two icons on it, Edge and File Explorer, and no store icon to be seen. So that worked. We got the start menu layout, we got the taskbar configuration, we've added that into the task sequence by copying that, so that's basically the steps that we need to do for customizing those two and adding it into MDT. That's the magic path: users default app data local Microsoft Windows shell. Yeah, don't memorize that. Fortunately, it is mentioned in the TechNet documentation, and you'll be able to get these slides and pull it up from there as well. Now, it gets a little tricky when you put in additional items that you want to pin, because you have to specify either the application ID for a universal Windows app or the path to the LNK file for a desktop application. So you have to find the path to the file and then put in the relative path using something like an environment variable to point to that. The TechNet docs have some pretty good examples on how to do that, but that will be tricky, so don't be surprised if you spend an hour or two messing around with this, trying to get this right the first time. That was me earlier today. It was rather messy, but once you get it in place, it works out pretty well. Next step in the list then, file type associations. I mentioned before that we can do that. Maybe we wanted to change the default browser. I don't want to do anything quite that severe this time around, but I'll at least show you conceptually what needs to be done. The first step would be to manually configure the file associations on an operating system. So if we go over to Windows 10 PC, we can run DISM, and we can ask it to export the current file associations. DISM online, export app, default app associations, and then tell it where. So it does that. It ends up with a XML file, which just basically says for every file association, here's the program that should be used to open that. So that's the default configuration. In order to change that, we would need to go into settings and manually tweak it, because otherwise coming up with those application IDs is kind of messy. We can do that for protocols like HTTP, or we can also do that for file types. In this case, I'll do file types. And after it loads up that whole big long list, we'll find one that I want to change. Find something relatively harmless like TIFF files. And I could change it from the default, which is normally the image viewer, to Paint. In this case, I've already deployed the new configuration to this machine, but the basic setting is it's going to be that by default. If we wanted to change it, we just need to come in and select the app that we want to change it to. So we'll go through this and tweak all the different file associations that we want. Once we've manually done that and we're happy with the result, we can then export it again using that same command, and then take the resulting file and copy it to the server where we can add it to a task sequence. So on the server side, we just do the opposite. In the task sequence that we run, we just need to specify that we want to import the associations. I copied that file earlier into the deployment folder, into the scripts folder, so that we could have a relative path to that. And then we can go into our task sequence again and put that in the appropriate place, which again, best way to do it is in Windows PE offline. So we can say we want to run a command line here and put in the command line for doing that. So that's what we end up with. Now when that task sequence runs, it runs the dism command, it changes the file associations, and those become the default in the operating system. Now for a lot of these things, you can also do this via group policy. You could go in and export the XML file of all the file associations and deploy that as a GPO. You could configure the start menu layout and deploy that via GPO. You could configure the taskbar layout, add it to that start menu configuration, deploy both of them together as a GPO. But in the case of the GPOs, they mandate that configuration rather than setting a default. So we're just setting defaults in the OS that the user can make changes to. If you want to do it mandated, then configure these as GPOs, but use the same XML files to do that. Next on the list, language packs, which is something that MDT, and I always hit the wrong button. They changed the numbers from yesterday. So with MDT, handling language packs has usually been fairly easy because there's one language pack cab file that you needed to download, and you could import that, and MDT would let you select any of the language packs that we needed. Unfortunately, Windows 10 made that a whole lot more complicated because there are now these other components. So if we look at a web page that describes that, there's a document that talks about adding language packs to Windows. And in that, it talks about the language pack itself, and then it says that there are other things like basic and text-to-speech and speech recognition and fonts and optical character recognition and handwriting recognition. So all of those become separate cab files. The language pack itself is pretty simple. We just need the ESES cab file to add Spanish support. But then we also need maybe one or more language interface packs if we needed to support some other variation of that language. We need a basic package to get spell checking, text prediction, word breaking, hyphenation. We may need some fonts, depending on the language. We may need some OCR recognition capabilities, handwriting recognition, text-to-speech, speech recognition, all of those really to make Cortana and some of the other speech features work correctly. So we had to grab all of those for a particular language. So all right, where do I download them? So you would think this would actually be useful. It would say OEM and system builders can get them from the dedicated download centers for OEMs and system builders. Well, how many of you are OEMs or system builders? None. Okay, so that doesn't work. Otherwise, users can do it by going into settings, time and language, region and language, and add it. Well, that doesn't help with imaging much. So in order to do this, we basically need to use the Volume License Service Center and download the language packs. Now, in my case, I don't have access to download stuff from the Volume License Servicing Center, but fortunately, they're also available on MSDN. So if we go to MSDN subscriber downloads. Oh, yeah. So you didn't see what I was actually looking at. The TechNet page here, actually it's an MSDN page, talks about all the different pieces that are required. It lists them all out. It then says you can get those from the OEM download center. Well, it doesn't tell you where to get them if you're a normal customer, but we need a language pack, basic pack, font pack, OCR pack, handwriting pack, text-to-speech pack, speech recognition, and optionally a Windows RE language pack as well. So lots of different files that we need. So MSDN subscriber downloads, we can search for Windows 10 language, and we'll see the language packs here. So I've already downloaded that. If we switch over to the server, Let me make sure I've got the right one mounted here. Server, media. So I've downloaded the language packs. That's the file that I got from MSDN. If we then look at what's in that file, no big surprise, it's a whole bunch of language packs. So that's the ISO. It has language packs for x64, and here's a list of all the language packs and the language interface packs, which are kind of the modifiers to the language packs. But where are all the other files? They're not included in this particular download. To get all the other files, you have to download something else. That something else is the Windows 10 Features on Demand ISO. So if we search for Windows 10 features, there's another ISO that's even bigger than the language packs file, language pack ISO, that contains those particular pieces. So again, if we mount that one, we can insert that ISO. And then see what's included inside of it. So here we have a much larger list of items. In this case, it's only for x64, so that was 5 gig of stuff only for x64. There's another 4 gig of stuff for x86. But if I wanted all of the remaining files for the Spanish language, I can search for the Spanish language ESES and see that there are text-to-speech, the speech files, the optical character recognition, handwriting recognition, and the basic language features. You don't need to worry about the retail demo offline content unless you're a retailer and want to run Windows demos on your machines, but the other files would be needed. So basically, to support a single language, I need to copy all of those files just for this one language. So once I've got that list of files, I can import it into MDT, which I've already done. If we look under Packages, I created a folder called ESES, and in that folder I imported all the files that I had copied off of those 2 CDs for this one particular language. The language pack itself, and the other things that need to be added to that OS as well. Now, the MDT processing will see the language pack file, and it'll prompt during the wizard for you to check the language pack to install it. So you can do that manually, or you could add an entry into customsettings.ini to automate that. The other pieces, it doesn't even know what these on-demand packs are, so it just treats them like any other updates and says, oh, these are for Windows 10 x64 build 14.393, these look like fixes I need to inject, so it automatically injects all the rest of them. Now, if you're going to import 10 languages in here and not tell MDT to selectively inject those using selection profiles, it would inject a whole bunch of stuff and really bloat your image, so be careful not to import too many of these without taking extra steps to filter those out. But with all of those in place, we really don't even need to do anything to the task sequence to support those, because we've already got steps in the task sequence and in the wizard to select those languages and to inject those other components. So the rest of it will just happen. I pushed the right button for once. The other note worth mentioning, there are some dependencies with updates and language packs. So if you install an additional language pack on top of a Windows 10 PC, you'll then have to reinstall the latest cumulative update on top of that PC, because the updates contain updated language resources. So as soon as you install a new PC, it needs all new language resources for any fixes that have been deployed. So it's best to install language packs before you install any patches, otherwise you're going to have to install the patches twice. So putting it all together then, we basically end up with one task sequence that contains all of those different steps. To remove apps using the PowerShell script that we looked at, to add apps, which we could do ourselves using DISM or PowerShell, but it's easy enough to just put the pieces together for MDT to do that for us. We can configure the start menu and the taskbar layout all at once by putting a layout modification.xml file into the right place in the default profile. We can configure the default apps by manually configuring that, exporting the list with DISM, and then importing it into an image, again using DISM. And we can add additional language packs on top of that. I mean, those are the types of customizations that we would look at and say, yeah, those are value-added customizations because they're pretty much required for every user. You would probably add additional applications into this, like Office and, well, maybe antivirus software, maybe a PDF reader app or something like that. So whatever it takes to save time during the deployment. But really, none of this is absolutely required with a custom image. You could just use the task sequence that we put together and deploy, and it would do all of these on the fly as the default install.wim is being deployed. So really the reason for then sysprepping it and capturing it and deploying the resulting image would be to save time, because it's going to cut out all of those extra steps and the time that it takes for those. So what we ended up with is the task sequence that we were building, this demo one. If I got all of the steps right, we should be able to deploy that. If we go over to a VM, I can at least kick it off, show you what that would look like. Got a machine ready to go. We can select our demo task sequence and initiate that. Now we probably, oops, I want to select the Spanish language while I'm here. We probably don't want to sit for an hour and watch this complete, so we'll fast forward a little bit as soon as I kick this off and look at a completed task sequence. With another checkpoint. Okay, so we're done at this point. We can click finish on the MDT task sequence. We can see our pinned icons in the taskbar are exactly what we wanted from before. We've got the start layout with the limited apps. We can see that the other apps that we didn't want were removed, like the 3D builder application, but we've still got important things like calculator. If we go into settings, we can see the default applications have been maintained. So if we search through the list, we would find the TIFF files and be able to see that they're still pointing at paint. The one piece that I still need to figure out was languages. So remember, we added a language pack. So if I search on languages, let's just look at add a language. We can see English, but we don't see Spanish. But if we then go to features, add an optional feature, we can see all the English extra stuff, and we can see all the Spanish extra stuff. So it added all the extra stuff, it didn't add the language pack. I think the language pack is actually there, it just didn't actually install it, so it's not showing up on that languages screen. But if we added it and selected Spanish, it probably doesn't need to actually download it. Of course, finding that in the list is always fun. Where is Espanol? There it is. And these are all the language interface pack options. In this case, I just want España. And now the language pack is installed. So I missed one little step. I just don't know what that one little step is. I need to do some more investigation of that. But those are the basic steps that are required to support that. And minus this one little tweak. But that's it. Any other questions or comments around?